So tonight I'm pondering about this question. What is it that makes us, the human species, so special and so distinct from all the other species that exist on this planet, from all the other animals and living things? Now, a lot of you might think, Melvin, it's a very, very simple question we can easily answer. Look at the things that we can do. For example, look at all these skyscrapers that we build in these modern cities. For example, Dubai, if you've been. Incredible marvels of human achievement and technology. No animals can come close to building what we've built. Yet, if you were to take a moment to look at the animal kingdom, for example, bowerbirds, you see that they're able to actually make very intricate and ornate nests, even though they actually have brains that are a fraction the size of ours, the size of almonds. You might think, no, Melvin, what about the fact that we have these really complex cities, these metropolises, that are truly, truly a marvel of human society? No animals come close. But then if you were to take a moment to look at ants, they are able to create these incredibly intricate and massive colonies that are truly unmatched even by human standards, and they have brains that are even tinier than almonds. And at this point you might think, no, Melvin, certainly intelligence. Think about the fact that we are mathematical. We can engage in this very complex mathematical thinking, solve these really complex problems. Animals can't do that. Yet if you were to look at slime molds and how they can solve very complex mathematical problems too in experiments, and they don't even have brains at all, you start to wonder what makes us special. Now, if you were to really compare human capability and animal and other living organisms and their capabilities side by side, certainly you would see that we are very capable, in most cases more capable than them. Yet what you will start to see is that we are generally just an outlier and more capable, perhaps more adept. We certainly aren't a genuine exception, many things I've just mentioned. So what is it that makes us so special? Well, it really comes down to one of many things, but one very interesting thing is religion. Now, we humans as a species are the only species on this planet that actually believes, and a lot of us do actually believe, in God. We question on our own origins, and a lot of us actually believe there's a supernatural source, that there is a creator. This very unique sense of thinking, believing in a God and the fact that there is a creator, is something that's very unique to our species, that truly sets us apart, for no animals actually engage in that sort of existential inquiry. And it's so fascinating because, of course, I've talked about in some of my videos where we look at it from a philosophical point of view, but scientists might have a very different perspective, and they certainly do. The idea of actually believing in God from a scientific perspective is a puzzle. It is a puzzle of both an evolutionary and also, I suppose, a sociological nature, because where exactly did this actually come from? Now, most scientists would say that it really comes down to this theory known as the cognitive byproduct theory, where we developed this natural feature of actually believing in God as a natural byproduct of how we actually developed our cognitive capacity and capabilities. Now, at some point, of course, in the human evolution as Homo sapiens, we start to develop very complex cognitive functions and abilities, and naturally we start to question many things, and certainly self-inquiry, questioning on our own existential existence, is something that happened, and naturally we started to develop the function to be able to actually believe in something much greater than ourselves, to actually recognize our own existence and question it. And this is perhaps where religion comes from. But what is even more puzzling than the origin of religion from a scientific point of view, and from the point of view evolution I've just mentioned, is we have certainly developed the ability to believe in a God, to believe that there's a creator in our existence. And this is a defining characteristic of our human species. But why is it, despite the fact that this is a feature of who we are, so many of us don't actually believe in God? In other words, what I'm asking is the root of atheism. I think it is no stretch today to say that most of us, and many of us, are actually atheists and identify as agnostics. And certainly the atheists would say that we have developed a point where we recognize that religion is actually a hindrance of human evolution, a hindrance of human development. And atheism naturally developed because we became much more intelligent and more rational. In other words, the two major suppositions that are being put out by atheists is firstly the idea that religion is actually a barrier to sociological development. And indeed, many atheists would actually go out to say that religion is actually bad for us. It encourages irrationality, immoral behaviors even, in terms of the conflicts that it can actually generate. And of course, a lot of recent political issues that we've seen have revolved around the idea of religion. And the second being that religion supplants rationality overall. That if we are really to engage in the scientific path of being enlightened beings, religion is a hindrance. But how true is that? Now, what is very fascinating is I've actually done some research, especially into the work of Dr. Will Gervais, a professor of culture and human evolution at Brunel University at London, and also the works of other researchers in this area. And what you will start to see is that we've too naively supplanted religion in favor of atheism, and too easily accepted these two major suppositions: the idea that atheism is somehow good for us, good for our sociological developments, and the second idea being that religion is totally irrational, and the second idea that atheism is rooted in rationality, and to be atheist is to be rational and lead the more enlightened path. In the work of Dr. Gervais, he's actually done a lot of experiments, one of the most interesting one being where they've actually constructed a fictional villain of a truly immoral and reprehensible character. Supposedly this villain murdered animals and human beings, dismembered them, truly a villain from one of those crime noir thriller movies. And of all the participants that were invited to try and characterize this villain, a very interesting commonality in terms of the characteristics that were being apportioned to this villain was the fact that more than 90% of the participants specifically assumed that this villain is no way religious. In other words, that they believed that this villain was actually an atheist. Another similar experiment that Dr. Gervais had done with researchers and professors at the University of Virginia, they had constructed a very elaborate characterization game where participants were asked to more or less construct a human being based on the characteristics that were given to them, almost an analogy to one of those police sketches where they were given lists of these characteristics and they were to pick the eyes and the look. And what Dr. Gervais and the rest of researchers did was eventually they compiled the average together. And what was interesting is that the construction of the facial feature of a religious person and also of an atheist person was of course very different. But yet with the atheist person, and of course I don't have the picture here, but you can search this up, they looked much more morally reprehensible, because what they did eventually was they showed these two sketches, these compiled sketches, to other participants, and the atheist was described as being much more antisocial, immoral, more aggressive, more untrustworthy, generally a lot of darker connotations. And what is so fascinating about these experiments that were done is that although we tend to see atheism, at least on a superficial level, as something that's much more progressive than religion alone, especially in the context of recent political crises, there is a part of us innately, at least through these experimentations, that shows that atheism is generally associated to the total opposite. We tend to be more apprehensive of atheism, and especially those who are actually atheists. It generally leads us to very negative connotations that perhaps as a part of collective human psyche that would challenge the ideas that atheism is a more progressive alternative to being religious. But of course, you might say it isn't about morality, Melvin. It isn't about progressiveness. We might not think that atheism is necessarily an avenue for these progressive moral developments of human society, but we are atheists and we are perhaps increasingly more atheistic because atheism is rooted in cognitive effort and ability, and the more that we have become more scientific and more rational, certainly more of us would become atheists, because that's just naturally the way it is. And this sort of thinking can trace itself back to recent history, especially to, I would say, the public work of Richard Dawkins, incredible popular scientist and thinker, who himself is an atheist, and he traces his atheism to his early readings in his life of the work of Darwin, of course, and the theories of evolution. And Dawkins would spend a big part of his public life actually on the offensive against religion, holding that atheism, being tied to science, is really the way to go, especially when you consider rational development. And naturally it makes sense, because if you are to look at science, and many of the scientific theories, they certainly are against religious beliefs. For example, human creation and the idea of the origin of the species. These could be at total odds of one another. But what is so interesting is that there have been so many rigorous experimentations done and published on peer-reviewed papers, like for example, the journal Science by Ara Norazayan, and in fact so many other follow-up studies that have been done on this exact topic, trying to trace whether rational thinkers report themselves as being less religious. And over the past decade, none of these studies have been able to conclusively demonstrate that correlation between atheism and rationality. In fact, many of the great scientific thinkers and even mathematicians have gone on to say that they are not necessarily more atheistic. A lot of them are actually very spiritual in their own ways or religious in their own ways, but there isn't a specific link. Another studies done by Stanford University, oversampling a greater population size, have actually revealed that a lot of the atheists, or those who self-profess to be atheists or agnostics, they're not necessarily more rational than the ordinary person who might be religious. And indeed, we don't even have to look at these scientific experiments and sociological experiments that are done. A lot of people who are atheists around us are not necessarily more rational or more scientific than people who profess to be more religious or spiritual. And my point here tonight is to say this. These two suppositions that we have, that we tend to take for granted, the idea that atheism is progressive or social development, and that atheism is a natural extension of rational development, both being able to facilitate those things, are ideas and suppositions that we really do take too naively without much consideration. We tend to like to write off religion very simply as being backwards, as being archaic, as being something that is counter to development, and we tend to hope atheism as being that better alternative, and that is not necessarily true. One very interesting consideration to tie everything up tonight is this. Throughout our human evolution, we have been endowed with minds that are capable and actually considering our own creation and the idea that there might be a creator. We have the ability to believe in God. This is something that's very unique to our species. And although a lot of us might quickly write off these religious beliefs as being silly, foolish, backwards, and perhaps even quaint when we look at some of the religious rituals that happen with our predecessors, we might laugh at it, but perhaps consider religion and religiousness has evolved as a form of cultural evolution to help us create more social and cooperative societies. Think about the social order that religion has actually brought about through its history. Of course, not always smooth and quite tumultuous, but certainly an order was created from the sociological phenomenon that is religion. But also think about, on the more psychological and personal level, what religion has been able to do, which is really give us a sense of self and sense of self-understanding. That sense of social development has been undoubtedly beneficial in helping us realize our ancestors' place in the individual world. And when you consider it from that perspective, you start to realize that religion is much more fascinating and perhaps much more useful and relevant than the very simple dismissal by atheists and agnostics of it being just this poison that is unnecessary and foolish. That sort of idea underplays the possibility that religion has over the millennia served a role in helping us survive and thrive. In other words, it had a role in human evolution. And that us having the ability to believe in God has a purpose in place. Of course, I'm not advocating that we should all believe in God. That is, of course, a personal choice. But I suppose what I do have apprehensions against is just the simple dismissal of religion being basically useless when you consider that it did have a very important role, and perhaps does have a very important role in our human development. And that if we can have a more open and holistic mind and perspective and approach to this, perhaps we can develop a more scientifically literate and mature relationship with religion that can truly help us understand its purpose in this world of ours.